Welcome back to theAnalysis-news. I'm Paul Jay. This is a continuation of my discussion with Denis Gorbach about the current situation and historical context of the conflict in Ukraine, the Russian invasion. I'll be back in just a few seconds. So once again, Denis Gorbach is a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Political Studies, Sciences Po in Paris. His research focuses on the politics of the Ukrainian working class. He's a member of the editorial collective of Commons, a Ukrainian socialist website. Previously, he worked as an economic journalist in the Ukrainian press. Thanks for joining me again, Denis.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, if you haven't watched part one, you really should. This is a continuation of that conversation. Before we get into the events of 2014, which is one of the arguments that much of the world left give, and Russia too, that a right-wing coup essentially overthrew a constitutionally elected government in an unconstitutional way. And that's the events that are happening now are one of the consequences of that. But before we get into that, let me go back to something you said in part one. If you see this to a large extent as ideologically driven by Putin and the people that support him, in other words, I guess you're saying the ideology of great power chauvinism, empire. Am I understanding correctly? What is the ideology?
So yes, this is what you might call imperial nationalism. So yes, there is one thing is the ideology of great power, that it is that Russia is a country that is predestined to command vast swaths of land and sea, and it has a very special destiny, and so on and so forth. Second of all, it is nationalism that is primordial. That is, there is this distinction between two kinds of nationalisms: the civic and ethnic one. What we see in Russia, as well as sadly often in Ukraine, is the understanding of a nation as an eternal entity that is almost timeless, that existed thousands, literally sometimes thousands years from now. So for Putin, there is this idea of empire plus the idea of the historical continuity. So, for example, Ukraine is also important for him. He says this. He has been saying it for many times, because Kiev is known as the mother of the Russian cities. I don't think it would be interesting to discuss this whole story of medieval spaces in the place of contemporary Russia and Ukraine. But the short story is that Kiev was the capital of this medieval formation, Principality of Rus, from which both Russia and Ukraine, and incidentally Belarus, all three consider that principality as the source of its statehood. In the Soviet times, the dominating conception was that the shared cradle of the three nations: Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, the renewed version of history dominating in Russia basically resuscitated the previous one, which was dominating under the empire. That is, that it is the monopoly of Russian people, which is much larger than the Russian people, and which is much larger than Russians per se, because it includes also the Belarusians and Ukrainians. So this is why this insistence on the fact that we are basically one people. There is no difference between us which can be read by an external viewer as a message of peace, like, you know, we're all brothers, because we're all brothers as humanity, and so on and so forth. There are no nations, but in this context, this means, in fact, this establishment of imperial domination, because you are, as Ukrainians, you don't exist. You are in fact Russians who have been duped by Austrian-Hungarian general staff, or today by the I don't know, US, UK, also by the Foreign Office in the UK, for example. You have been duped into believing that you are something which you call Ukrainians, something separate from Russians. So this is also an important element of this of this type of nationalism, of this ideology.
And is it different than the American nationalism and view of the need of the world to have essentially American hegemony?
In terms of the ultimate aim of establishing hegemony, no. So I mean, in this sense, this is more or less the same ambition to dominate. Maybe the US is a bit different because it is a hegemon. Has been until recently, in fact, a hegemonic power in the international politics. That's why they rather claim for the continuation of their monopoly worldwide. Russia is not that ambitious in this sense. I mean, the Russian imperialism aims at dividing the world into zones of influence, zones of exclusive interests. So their ideal is rather the pre-First World War world, which was divided between the great powers. They only are mad because they are not allowed their place. They think they ought to be allowed into this great concert of nations.
Well, you can't be a global hegemon if you allow regional hegemons unless they're sub-hegemons to you. Otherwise, you're not the global hegemon anymore, which I think is certainly one of the underlying causes of all this. So let's just go back, though, to understand more than Russians' motivation. So you have this sort of great power ambition. It can also be called treating Putin with respect, is the other way to phrase it. But I mean, personally, I think there's some truth to it. As I said in the part one, if you're going to have a capitalist world, a country with the size of population, the technological base, the resource base, I mean, this is a potentially much bigger power than it actually is. And I guess if it wasn't so addicted to being a fossil fuel economy, there's no reason why it shouldn't be even more powerful than Germany is economically. It should. It isn't, but it should. But all that being said, that's not a justification for invading anybody, and certainly not for attacking and killing civilians and soldiers. I want to say and soldiers because a lot of people focus on the killing of civilians, and I think it's just as much a crime to be killing Ukrainian and Russian working class kids who are told to go off and kill each other. That being said, I don't get what the strategy was here. One, is this like an Afghan situation? Was he goaded? Was Putin goaded into expanding what might have only been an occupation of Donbass? Did the Americans deliberately arm Ukraine and then use all this? He's going to invade. So if he doesn't invade, he looks like he's backing down. Afghanistan, Brzezinski says we sucked the Soviet Union into this war. Did he get sucked into this? Because I don't get what the end game is here. You install a pro-Russian government. Well, then if you don't occupy, that government doesn't last 5 minutes, I think. If you don't install a pro-Russian government and you end up, even if you get what should have been done years ago, a declaration by Ukraine not to join NATO, that should have been done years ago. It should have been done months ago, weeks ago, and it should be done now because it's never getting into NATO anyway. Even Zelensky admitted that a few days ago. So what is the point of making it an issue? And of course, the Americans should have declared it too. But still, if you don't have a pro-Russian government, you don't occupy, you pull back, even if you occupy Donbass, then what was the point of all this, given that you gave the West everything they wanted, a reunification of NATO, an excuse to attack the Russian economy in a way that they could never have done without this. I'm sure they would have loved to have do it at any point, but they couldn't justify it until now. And here's where you get another be careful what you wish for, West, a remilitarized Germany, which ain't going to be good for the West or Russia, potentially in the long run. So what the hell was Putin thinking? I don't get it.
Well, yes, there is this pattern of explanation which you've mentioned, which I find a bit amusing, because it goes like this: the cunning Americans have planned everything, so they somehow hypnotized Putin and made him spend a year placing the troops along the border of Ukraine, and manipulated him into invading Ukraine. So I mean, this is extremely complicated, unnecessarily complicated.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they're that smart, but
it's just that.
But explain it then.
I don't know what's your policy on profanities, but
you can say what you want.
It's in our part of the world, in Ukraine and in Russia, there is this expression. When someone finds himself in the position of Putin explaining all his faults by the evil will of the others, is that has someone again shed into your pants? Mm. So
okay, but let's say it wasn't some deliberate plan. I'm not saying it was or wasn't, because it does seem like more than they're capable of. I still don't get how he thinks he wins out of this.
Yeah, so it's from what we can see now, from what is likely obvious at this point, is that there has been extremely severe miscalculation of the situation in Ukraine. It looks like the higher leadership, like Putin personally, has been almost duped by his own propaganda. He did not have access to realistic evaluation of the situation on the ground. It is so. On the one hand, there is a leaked text by a Russian by someone at least claiming to be a Russian FSB officer, who states as much. I'm not sure whether we can trust it, whether we can take it at face value or not. If we take it at face value, it says that exactly this is what happened, that the Secret Service, the FSB, the intelligence services, have been basically doctoring their reports, because nobody told them to be that they were expected to realistically assess this option of invasion. So this is why they were giving their reports in a more optimistic under more optimistic source, just to keep the bosses calm. Because if they had known that this is a realistic option, they would be more serious about it. But otherwise, they saw no use in making bosses angry.
There's some believability in that when you see this moment that was on television, where Putin has these heads of his, I guess it's cabinet and heads of agencies, and the head of his foreign intelligence service is dressed down like a 12-year-old embarrassed schoolboy in front of Putin. I mean, if that's the way he talks to the people that are supposed to be giving him advice, then yeah, you guess they're saying what they think he wants to hear.
And there is also an indirect evidence, which is more objective, which is the way in which the invasion has been planned militarily. from the way in which basically the tanks and other equipment rolled in without any, so they didn't take care they didn't take any precautions. So they were just rolling along the road and letting themselves be hit by Ukrainian forces, because they didn't expect to be hit. They were doing it like they were still in Russia. So there were also when we look at the first hours and the first days, it was obvious that they expected to not waste any forces on fights anywhere except Kiev. The aim is to capture Kiev very quickly in 1 or 2 or maximum 3 days, to establish their puppet government in the capital, and this should have been the end of the story.
And they must have thought there'd be significant support for it in Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky was down, at about 24% in the polls. He was considered a real failure as a president. Of course, now he's 80% or whatever in the polls. He's a hero. But before, his government did look like a disaster. So they thought this was going to be a popular cakewalk.
Exactly, yes. Also, again, a third thing to consider is, to consider in favor of this theory, is Putin's appeal to Ukrainian military. I don't remember which day of the invasion it was, but at some early stage. But when it was already clear that it was not going the way it was supposed to go, he said that, yeah, so I'm talking to Ukrainian military men, yeah, just to get rid of this band of drug users and Nazis and get stage a coup, because with you are certainly a serious man, and with you we will reach an understanding more easily, which again shows an utter lack of understanding of Ukraine, what it is politically, what is the situation in the military, because yeah, so there was simply a complete lack of the data. Plus, there was a memory of the 2014 hostilities, and it should be said that Ukraine in 2014 is very different from the Ukraine in 2022.
Meaning that in 2014, Ukraine had no ability to resist what happened in Crimea.
The lack of military capacities, but also the lack of this unity. So in 2014, there was no problem with establishing occupational administration, for example. Currently, this is a big problem for the Russian forces who are currently holding Melitopol, Kherson, and some other cities they control.
When it's so obvious that Ukraine was not going to be allowed into NATO, formally at least, meaning no Article 5, which is significant. And even Zelensky, as I said in part 1, has admitted that a few days ago. There were lots of people in Ukraine in the weeks leading up to the invasion and before, saying Ukraine should declare neutrality right now, get it off the table. And Zelensky wouldn't do it. Was it simply because he was afraid if he did it, he'd be overthrown himself?
This is this is the case very much, because he is he's probably much more constrained in his potential, in his options than it might seem from the outside. He looks like an extremely determined young man, but it's just that he does not have a second option. The situation is in the dominating mood in the society is such that if before the invasion he would suddenly do this U-turn, he would face a very real possibility of a nationalist coup.
And so talk about the strength of the right-wing nationalists, and I guess this will get us back to 2014 to some extent. And amongst right-wing nationalists, there's a lot of out-and-out fascists. There's a video out there of this guy on one of the Ukrainian television channels that's still on, because a few have been taken off because they were considered pro-Russian. And this guy's talking about killing Russian Muscovite children. He overtly quotes Eichmann, saying the way to kill a nation is to kill its children, and says he personally wants to go kill Russian children. Now, I know this in no way represents the vast majority of Ukrainian people, but there's probably more overt Nazis in an organized fashion, and even in the military, and now looking like they even have a TV channel. I mean, it's more significant than a lot of other countries. And I have to say, again, my leftist Russian friends point to this, that this is something, you know, the strength of fascists and Nazis in Ukraine is a more significant thing than people in other countries might think.
So I would like to divide this question in two, because there are two different things here. I will first speak a little bit about that guy, because this is, I mean, he is visibly not a part of the Ukrainian Nazi scene. I mean, this is at least to me this is evident. This here is a dreadful, horrible manifestation of the general growth of these xenophobic attitudes in the wider society as the war progresses. So the guy, I don't know who he is, just some random journalist. Yes, he says these extremely stupid and barbaric things, quoting Eichmann, even put in his portrait to make sure that we make no mistake. This is I'm afraid to say that this is probably natural, as sad as it is, in a war like this, that the enemy is dehumanized, and we have the precedents for this in the Soviet history, because at the beginning of the Second World War, the Soviet leadership was extremely careful, extremely politically correct. Even after Hitler invaded, the official propaganda line was that the Germans, we are brothers with the German working class, and it is Hitler who divides us, and so on and so forth. But by the end of the war, there was this famous poem by Sergei Eisenstein, which with the refrain, kill the German as many times as you see him. This is the plea of your mother. This is the plea of the burned village, and so on and so forth. So very bloodthirsty. And the Communist Party reprimanded him publicly. So said that Comrade Eisenstein exaggerates, but this was the general mood, as sad as it gets. And so this.
Let me just add to that: Americans cheered the firebombing and nuclear bombing of Japanese civilians in World War II. So this is not unique. It's awful.
Right. Yes. So and the longer the war lasts, the greater will be such mood. So basically, the only way to prevent this whole thing is not to say that, oh, bad Ukrainians, but rather to make sure this ends as soon as possible. Now, the second thing is actual Nazis. So the structures, the political movements of an extreme right, of a Nazi fascist character. This is certainly a great problem in Ukraine, and your Russian friends are at least partially right in attributing it to the Euromaidan events. It was not a Nazi coup. That one I can say.
Okay,
for
people that aren't that familiar, we're talking about essentially a coup that took place in 2014. That a lot of people start their history of what's happening now from there. And there's these competing documentaries that people are probably seeing. There's one documentary that ascribes everything that went wrong to this right-wing fascist groups that took over this democratically, I shouldn't say this, elected government that changed its mind about Europe. Anyway, you explain it.
Yes, I will try. So yeah, what happened at that point was, as we have seen in the first part of our talk, there was this growing polarization inside the country around between the two identitarian projects, between the two identities, and the president Yanukovych, he was not exactly pro-Russian. In his foreign policy, he wanted to join the EU, but then he faced this pressure from outside, from Russia, and finally he was forced to reconsider, to make this horrible, to make this U-turn, which was met with outrage by the society, because previously, during a year or a year and a half, this very same Yanukovych was telling them from every TV channel how great European Union is and how we are moving towards that aim. So this U-turn makes people get into the streets. And what kind of people were in these streets? Here we should again remember the specificity of the post-Soviet working class, which is extremely depoliticized. I mean, people can be politicized in the sense of their interest to politics as a show, but precisely as a show. So they do not, for them, politics is something external, is a world outside of their concern, is a game of ideologies and of manipulations. So when people take to the streets, like they do in Ukraine once in a while, they do so with a very simplistic, very vague picture, political picture in their heads. So they protest against everything which is bad, which is what, corruption in the first place. So something very undescribable. You cannot pin it down. What is corruption? What is not? I mean, okay, it's difficult at least. And they protest in favor of whatever they think is vaguely good. So what is vaguely good in their situation was Europe, the idea of Europe, which for them was the embodiment of simply good life, of economic prosperity, of rule of law, and of a general high level of culture.
And there's a background to this too, which is years and years and years in the Soviet Union and the East. These countries all had these dreams about the West being paradise. And I did a documentary film in Albania in 89, 90. And I remember this quote from a high school student who said to me, "We know the West isn't paradise, but we don't know what it lacks from paradise." And they knew it was probably an illusion, but the illusion was better than the alternative. So you hope for the best of the illusion.
Exactly. Yes. So there is this extremely idealized vision of West, and more specifically European Union, as something as much more than it is in fact, as an organization, and it gets then these civilizational undertones, the undertones of the civilizational struggle between the economic and political paradise of the West being the manifestation of the superior European civilization, and Russia being somehow antinomic to all this, all Russia / Soviet Union, because this is all very mixed. This gets very mixed up. So this is kind of externalized as the other, the civilizational other. From this, it is still very far to call these people racists and so on. So this is just very disoriented people with no political agenda at all, with a very rudimentary understanding of ideologies, of whatever ideology they declare to adhere to, and within this crowd, like many millions of people standing in this square, who have nothing more than flags, the national flags in their hands, and maybe the flags of the EU, and no other more specific ideas. There you see one extremely small, like numerically marginal group of people who have very specific ideas politically. So they say that, yeah, we have some clear agenda. We present you this agenda, and in fact it doesn't look very frightful. It doesn't look scary. It's about the domination of a nation, the national interest. Okay, that probably sounds legitimate. Yeah, nation, sure, why not? So they offered some kind of clarity, but even more importantly, they offered organizational structure, which lacked elsewhere.
And these are right-wing nationalists.
Yes. The mostly football hooligans and the far right. So the far right football hooligans. Yeah.
Well, they may be on the street, but there's got to be some oligarchs, and clearly from some of the leaked phone calls, the Americans have a finger here, and maybe more than that. So somebody's sort of helping organize this and plan it.
By the beginning of this whole story, most of the far right scene was concentrated under the roof of one party called Svoboda, Freedom in Ukrainian. This party indeed had very tight connections to the oligarchs. They were, one could say, with a certain degree of certainty, that they were promoted deliberately by this East Slavic government of Yanukovych as their antipodes. So there had been certainly backhand deals in order to, because they were very present on the TV screens, on the oligarchic TV screens, as the carriers of this agenda. But the thing is that these far right, the larger part of the far right at the beginning of the Maidan events were actually quite passive, because they were following the line of the institutional opposition, which was like, yeah, sure, we are against the bad government. Yeah, let's stand and just demand our rights and whatnot. So
it seemed like the most radical demand at that point from those people seemed to be early elections. It wasn't even resign, right?
Yeah. And the far right, which organized itself, which was later known as the right sector. In fact, it was an ad hoc coalition of everyone, of all the Nazis who hated Svoboda, so who had previously refused to merge into this vertical party structure controlled by the institutional forces. So these were remnants of the old organization, from old structures from the 90s that had been pretty marginal, in fact, and currently they saw an opening for themselves. As for phone calls and other stuff, frankly, I don't know what I mean. Yeah, I can't comment because I don't know about that.
Well, there's a text of a leaked call between U.S. officials deciding who they wanted next. This is before the coup takes place, and they're deciding who they think the next leader should be.
But that's. Yeah, but but they didn't.
Victoria Nuland, I guess her name.
So the fuck the EU speech. Yeah. But the far right, I doubt very much that they were like pawns directly controlled, manipulated. It was much more spontaneous. I mean, there is nothing strange about a bunch of marginal people who had spent years training in the woods with the firearms and used to wearing fatigues, now that they see an opening for them, finally, yes, sure, they are the first and on the barricades, and they are the first who start throwing Molotov cocktails at the police that is trying to push the crowd. So the police starts advancing at the crowd, but then suddenly the crowd, instead of standing still or moving back, starts. So there are all of a sudden a number of young men who begin throwing Molotov cocktails, and this is the beginning of this radicalization of the spiral of violence in the Maidan.
So then there's a day that takes place where there's a march to the parliament buildings, where there's going to be these demands are going to be presented, and the government responds with even more violence after quite a bit of violence. And one of the narratives goes that there were snipers shooting, and these snipers, there's a debate were the snipers from the far right, were the snipers from the government. Anyway, pick it up from there. What's your take?
Yes, so there is this announcement of the so-called peaceful advance towards the parliament, and then it suddenly becomes much less peaceful. People are moving from the protesters advance to the parliament, which stands on the hill, and then the riot police starts attacking them, running down from the hill, so they get the advantage. And then suddenly one can hear the gunshots. And yes, there is a large space for all kinds of conspiracy theorizing about those snipers. From what I mean, I'm not a specialist on that, so I didn't spend hours analyzing videos. From the general knowledge that I have, it seems obvious that there were snipers on the part of the riot police, because these videos, even I saw them. B, there were guns widely accessible to the population, to the protesters as well. So there is nothing that can exclude that there were gunshots from both sides, and it's certainly extremely difficult to pinpoint who exactly shot whom at what point in time.
So within a day or two of that, I guess, Yanukovych flees the country. Why? Did he lose the support of the military?
Well, we can only theorize at this point whether what would be the situation if he decided to push for the violent scenario. Probably yes, there was still such a possibility, but I mean we were not there, so we do not know. What we do know is that for one reason or for another, he decided not to radicalize the situation even further, and finally to flee the country after having received guarantees of security and the corridor from the Russian. Did he plan to return afterwards on the back of the Russian forces? This is very probable. Again, we don't know that. This would be a counterfactual. What we do know, again, is that the elite, that was not the military, but the political and economic elite, the famous oligarchs who had supported Yanukovych previously, were very quickly, already by the time they were in disarray, large factions of the elite declare that they do not support the president anymore. They stand against Yanukovych, and the last straw was probably the Party of Regions, so his own party, the political structure, which was very centralized and which basically governed the country, declared that they exclude Yanukovych from their own ranks because he did not he turned out to be a traitor to his own party, and so on and so forth.
Well, the Ukrainian oligarchs that were pro-EU and thought they'd be richer oligarchs under the roof of the EU must have been taken aback by his about turn on the EU and his deal with Putin. So, am I correct? A significant section of the oligarchs would have wanted to get rid of him at this point.
There was no homogeneity in the elites about that. So a large part, maybe the larger part of the, I'm not sure about that. So anyway, a significant part of the oligarchs, yes, they were already oriented towards the West economically, and they certainly did not want this economic integration with Russia. The other part was the other part saw no future outside of the common market with Russia. So this is especially true for the manufacturers of machinery, of more complicated production, which was not competitive in the West, but so they produced for the Russian markets, and they were the most pro-Russian faction in the oligarchy. And then there were people who were generally in the middle, like, for example, exactly this famous son-in-law of Kuchma, the oligarch named Viktor Pinchuk, whose main business is metal pipes. And he produces, he had nothing good to expect from the integration with the Russian economic space. Because he would face, he would probably face a hostile acquisition very soon. But his main market was in fact Russia for the pipes. The famous Russian oil and gas industry bought his metal pipes to lay new pipelines. So there was this ambiguity, and if we impute class interest for the oligarchs as a whole at that point in time, it would probably be to stay within the status quo. So to remain in this interstitial political and economic space between the two empires, between Russia and the EU. It looks like objectively this has not simply been tenable anymore, because both the EU on its part and Russia on its part were being more and more assertive, and they were letting Ukrainians know that they had to choose, and any kind of choice would be very painful for the economy and for the oligarchs. Either way.
Let me park my next question about that. Just first of all, ask this, just to wind this up. A lot of the argument that tries to explain why Russia invaded and to some extent justify it is that the Americans manipulated 2014. And it was because of the American involvement that Lukashenko has to run and the pro-Western government comes to power. How important was the American factor in all this?
Well, there was this video with Victoria Nuland handing out food for the protesters, which was very amusing, and then it was used thousands of times to prove American meddling. Frankly, I doubt. I mean, I certainly doubt very much that it was a planned event, that it was somehow guided from the very beginning to the very end. On the other hand, I see nothing extraordinary in the probability that that American secret services, that the American state, in any case, was following the situation closely and reacted accordingly, trying to adjust its policies. So it would be strange if it would not have been the case. As any
they saw an opportunity and did whatever they can to manipulate the outcome.
But it seems to me that even so, I personally tend to believe that that nobody wanted actually to depose Yanukovych, because at least this was clearly true for Ukrainian opposition. So for the parliamentary parties in the opposition, they were extremely satisfied with this decision, this final decision, the last decision taken jointly with Yanukovych about the elections that should take place a year later, about the constitutional reform and something else. So they got their power, and there was no reason for them. I mean, they did not push for anything more than that. I think this is one of those moments where we can safely acknowledge the free play of social forces at hand, the moment of extreme weakness of the state, but also of the opposition. So the crowd, which is not securely controlled by anyone, and also neither by the American intelligence services, and so the moment of extreme undecisiveness, of the lack of determination, in which it is enough for a random guy to jump up on the stage and say, yeah, like what the hell, are we going to settle on this now? Did we spill our blood for Yanukovych to remain president one more year, to just electrify crowd and to push it into the direction into which it was not going to go like a minute before. Again,
but there are television channels owned by oligarchs who are really promoting this, right? It's not just the random guy.
They were promoting what and at what point? There were television channels that during the course of these protests, during the weeks that they lasted, that they reoriented their politics towards basically supporting or at least covering these protests. Yes, that is so. But I'm speaking about this very, very short and decisive moment of when the mood changed from, okay, surely we all support the protesters and we want the opposition to prevail, and now that opposition seems to have prevailed with these accords, everything seems to be fine. And then afterwards, this all suddenly changes into, yeah, let's get down Yanukovych, let's just get killed and blah, blah, blah. And boom, this is not something that was supported institutionally, explicitly or implicitly, by way of propaganda on the TV. That was not the case. Then afterwards, after the change of the power, surely the TV and everyone else adjusted themselves.
And after the change of government, there's a lot of suppression of pro-Russian forces, right?
There is this, yes, there is this conflict, there is this government in Kiev, which takes place of the president that has fled the country. It is all very unclear legally. I mean, yeah, you call it a coup. Yeah, it can be called that. You can call it also a revolution. It is more pleasantly sounding, but basically this relates to the same events if you are a lawyer. Yeah, so there is this climate of uncertainty and genuine fear in the southern and eastern regions, which is opportunistically certainly exploited by Russia on one hand, which heats up the situation, but also by a part of Ukrainian oligarchs who see in these protests, who see the opportunity to negotiate for a bigger piece of the pie in the new political configuration.
So let's get back to present day, and we're going to talk again another time and do more history. I know that, if I understand correctly, you're arguing no to NATO and no to Russia, that there should be an independent Ukraine, and you're part of a socialist website. Your vision's an independent socialist Ukraine. if I have it right.
Uh,
What was your ability to organize in Ukraine? To what extent, either from Zelensky and government forces and or the far right, to what extent was the left targeted prior to the invasion?
It was not exactly an object of political. I mean, it was not targeted as a political agent, simply because it is too weak, the left in Ukraine. So starting from these events from 2014, the left were at that point they lived through an enormous split, as did the Russian left, by the way. So Ukrainian crisis managed to split the left in both countries.
What was the nature of the split in Ukraine?
Which party to support, which part of the conflict to support. So they were the left who saw their chance, to promote their agenda at the Maidan. So who tried to align their a socialist agenda with the demands of the Euromaidan protesters, and there were the left who did the diametrically opposite thing, who joined the protesters in Odessa, in Kharkiv, in Donetsk, hoping that there would be a political opening for them in the new regimes in the separatist republics
in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah. Yes.
Of which much of the Russian left supported them.
I mean, in Russia there was also a split. I don't know which was the larger part or not, but yes, certainly there was an important part, maybe the larger part of the Russian left, that went for the support of Ukrainian separatism, so basically for the support of their own government, in hoping that this is some kind of a working class uprising, simply for the simple fact that red flags were tolerated in one place and not tolerated in the other place. So this was already enough for some people to make their decision. Well, yeah.
Well, let's end with this. However one analyzes this, and I'm talking now about progressive people outside of Ukraine, almost everybody agrees, either wholeheartedly or half-heartedly, that this invasion is illegal. These laws about respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity, at least as far as I'm concerned, are not there primarily to defend the government and elites of these countries. It's to defend the populations of these countries from being slaughtered. And the law is very clear. UN Charter is very clear. You do not invade unless your country is under imminent threat. And while I don't think in terms of scale there's any comparison between what Russia's done in Ukraine and what the United States did in Iraq, and there's no comparison since World War II, and even if you include the fire bombings of Japan and the nuclear bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there's no comparison that the largest, greatest war criminal on planet has been the United States. And it has to be seen, it's not a devil, it's just the dominating force of global capitalism. And when you're the dominator of global capitalism, you think you can do whatever the hell you want. On the other hand, all the big scale war crimes, including the war in Vietnam, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, I mean, they've all ended as debacles for the United States. On the other hand, that's another conversation. But the fact that Russia has violated international law in Ukraine, there's no need for a conversation of whether it's not as bad as what the Americans did. Yeah, okay, the Americans have killed far more people than anyone. But if you're Ukrainian right now, you're suffering from Russian invasion. And any abstract conversation about who's worse is kind of irrelevant. So all that said, what do you want? What do progressive Ukrainians want from people outside, from the left outside, what should people do if they really want to show solidarity and respect for international law?
First of all, I would continue your thought, your
rant.
idea about. I would continue it, but by reiterating the fact that it is high time to reassess optics, because reading exclusively geopolitical framework just simply does not do, neither ethically nor analytically. It doesn't help you to understand. And if you are thinking in terms of exclusive zones of influence and so on, without admitting the agency of working class men and women, it is problematic from the leftist point of view, but it also doesn't help you to understand the reality. So yes, first thing is probably to make it easier for Ukrainians to relieve them of the responsibility to spend efforts explaining the legitimacy of their resistance, right? Which is something that Palestinians or Kurds do not have to do. So in their case, everything is clear for them. In the case of Ukrainians, they have to do lectures about the Ukrainian Nazis and whatnot. Now, in terms of actual solidarity, what would be a good idea to do? Beyond the simple fact of supporting Ukrainian resistance, at least morally, there is a campaign that some comrades in Ukraine as well as in the US already starting for canceling Ukrainian debt, external debt, which, okay, I don't have the figure in my mind, but it is very high. It is mostly a debt to the IMF. It only keeps growing. And certainly if we want the situation to improve somewhat, at least after the war, the way out would be in some kind of a Marshall Plan, which will not be possible without a debt relief. So this is I would say the area in which the efforts of the international left would be the most useful, the least controversial for them. So they do not have to cheer for NATO. They have to fight the familiar enemy of the IMF, and this would be for the general good of everyone.
Does there not also need to be a demand, no NATO for Ukraine, even though, as I say, there probably won't be? But and what about this issue of at the very least, once the conflict's over, assuming it will be, and assuming there's still a Ukrainian government that isn't the puppet Russian government, to stop this militarization of Ukraine?
Yeah. So
which let me just add, raises probably the thorniest question for the left that's used to not wanting any militarization. What attitude should the left have, in your view, towards further arming of Ukraine in the current moment?
Well, this attitude, I mean, I understand this this disposition, but I must say that it is relatively recent, historically speaking, because traditionally the socialist movement has grown up as a movement, as a phenomenon in the 19th century, supporting the armed struggle of the Irish, of the Polish, of the Hungarians. In the 20th century, yeah, there was Vietnam, the African peoples, and all the other smaller countries which were supported. So this is not there was no talk about stopping arms flow to Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, I mean, everybody understood, everybody accepted that the USSR and China should help Vietnam fight militarily. So and I would probably share that position as long as the war lasts. I would see this as a justified position from my point, from the point of view of my understanding of socialism, of leftist agenda.
That there should be support at least as long as the war is on.
Yes.
That the Ukrainian people should be armed.
Yes. There is a different question of no-fly zone, which is extremely popular in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, what's your take on that? Zelensky was just yesterday spoke to Congress again, calling for a no-fly zone.
I mean, it seems that the name, the very name, is a bit misleading. So I reckon that most people who call for it simply don't realize what it in fact means.
But Zelensky must understand. It seems to me completely reckless on his part to keep pushing it.
Anyway, I'm not in his head, so I will not answer for him. But on my behalf, yeah, I can agree that this is one of the more irresponsible demands, and that that nobody will win from a direct confrontation between the American and the Russian air power. But yeah, people just demand it because it sounds like a smart way of preventing Russian air force to bomb Ukraine. Sadly, there is no such a smart way to just block Ukrainian sky militarily, right? After the war, as for militarization and NATO and stuff like this, I think in order to get rid of this unipolarity of the traditional cliches in the West, in the leftist statements, I'm thinking currently of reformulating this traditional demand of dismantling NATO. Sure, it should be dismantled. I mean, I'm no fan of the NATO, but I think what can be underlined here is the disequilibrium between the great powers and the small nation states. And so if in principle I support disarmament of everyone in the world, I think we should do it progressively, and we should start with exactly with the big powers, with the overarmed powers, be it Russia or the US or the UK or China and so on and so forth. And maybe the first step would be to disarm, for example, destroy, let's say, nuclear arsenal. This is a demand that has been on the agenda since the 60s already, and for a while it looked like the nuclear weaponry is a force for good, that it prevents bad stuff from happening. But now we see that is no more the case, that the nuclear nuclear forces do not deter other nuclear forces from doing bad stuff. So I think we can all agree about that. We can also agree about stores of other weapon that is already kind of destroyed, that is already kind of denounced and even outlawed by the international law, such as cluster bombs, cluster munitions, thermobaric munitions, phosphorus bombs, which nevertheless were used in Syria, which are now used in Ukraine. No phosphorus bombs so far, but the others, yes. And which all leads me to think that the greatest takeaway from this war should probably be some radical reassessment, reinforcement of the UN as an international governance agency. I mean, yeah, surely you are skeptical, as we all are, but I don't see any other way. So maybe this can be a part of utopian, if you will, reasonably utopian, reasonably reformist leftist agenda of rebuilding this world, making it safer.
In terms of the peace negotiations going on right now between Ukraine and Russia, should the Ukrainian government simply take two things off the table clearly? No NATO, and there'll never be nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Why not say it?
To me, this does sound reasonable. The question is rather about its political acceptability to Ukrainians, because in the current situation. So today, as long as Ukraine is not defeated militarily. So as long as people do not feel that there is no other option, so in this situation when there is still resistance and it is reasonably successful, it will not be accepted. It will not be acceptable politically, so domestically. To me, maybe it is unfortunate. I mean, it is unfortunate because I don't argue for NATO membership of Ukraine, so I would be fine with it personally. But such is the situation, and unfortunately, also it looks like Putin also has no possibility or no incentive to back off, which is why we will probably not see anything good coming out of negotiations at this stage.
All right, well, on a rather pessimistic note, but at any rate, I would say, as far as progressive people outside the demand, I think, one, yeah, we should demand from the Ukrainian government those two things: no NATO, never nuclear weapons, which I think are probably never happening anyway. So they might as well say it. The idea that for some supposed prestige, you can't say it. But mind you, there's nothing unique about that to Ukrainians. That's been the road to hell in so many situations. And in fact, this inability to accept anything that might lower prestige is that fundamental to US policy, and is exactly the kind of thing that could lead to nuclear war. And it's the same thing for the Russians. This bullshit that you can't look weak is more important than anything else. Is the thing that's could kill us all.
I'm just following Ukrainian social networks, so I can comment on that. It's even not about prestige for the people at this stage. It's just I see many megabytes of text with the moral outrage about the Westerners who like refuse to do anything substantial militarily for Ukrainians, like in their view. So who do not protect them, but then they also have the audacity to demand from Ukraine, which is clearly the victim here, to do concessions to the aggressor.
Well, let me just add the second part of what I was saying, which is the first thing, obviously, is Russia needs to get the hell out of the Ukraine before anything, even perhaps before there's any concessions, but whatever. The invasion's illegal. It should end. I mean, I think, and most people are saying that. Even people that get into sort of a mitigated, complicated argument are also saying Russia should get out. So I mean, I think that's paramount position. But playing with the apocalypse, which is a lot of, on all sides people are doing, is nuts.
Sure. Yes, I agree with you completely. It's just that my remark was simply about the rhetoric. So, for example, if you are an ambitious leftist organization which is preparing a statement, it's probably a bad idea to put a resolutive part of it, like to formulate it like, yeah, we demand from Russia to withdraw and from Ukraine to promise to swear that they will not join the NATO, because this the modality of the but substantially this is exactly, yes, this is normally, I think this should be an acceptable outcome in any reasonable scenario.
Okay, I hope we talk again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news.